right, welcome everyone to another episode of the Cosmic Matrix. This time again with your hosts Bernhard and Laura Matsu. We're doing a little bit of a long distance transmission. I'm here in Topanga Canyon. Laura is currently on Vancouver Island. Before we go into today's episode, which is a big one, I wanted to just make a little announcement about our upcoming time of transition retreat in the Peruvian high jungle, November 25th until December 1st. We just had a time of transition retreat in June, and it was amazing, very successful, with a great group of people. So we decided to do another one towards the end of the year. And you can find more about it on my website, veilofreality.com, or at Laura's website, lauramatsu.com. And at that retreat, we do various different talks, workshops, and embodiment practices from the bigger picture perspective. But most importantly, the individual process, the inner work. We will giving practices relating to yoga, kundalini, a lot of meditation practices, somatic work, psychological inner work, shadow work, and many, many other things to really, heal what needs to be healed in order to anchor and align more with the divine. And it's an amazing opportunity to do this in the surroundings of the Amazon. Very powerful energies there. I've been there already 6 or 7 times at that place, Shirapa Manta Eco Lodge. And Laura and I are fusing our work together, and especially working with the group, it's very, very powerful in person. And this retreat is limited to only 9 people. So if anybody's interested, I think we're already almost halfway full. But again, go to our websites and you can find more about it and see how, and also how to apply and whatnot. So now, today's episode, this is a big one. And it is a big one for a reason. It's called Trauma, Occult Forces, and the Matrix. And the reason I say it is a big one is this is, I think, literally the 4th or 5th time we're trying to record this podcast. Over the past 10 days or so, we have been dealing with, you can blame Mercury retrograde, but that was just beyond technical difficulties. We've been dealing with interferences and all kinds of paranormal events just to right around the time we started recording or during the recording. So we hopefully feel that this will go without any interferences now. So trauma, occult forces, and the matrix. It also ties into a big topic, what we call the matrix trauma installment program, because as many of you maybe already know, based on my work also, or on Laura's work into occult realities, the hyperdimensional matrix is that these hyperdimensional forces and entities basically target our wounds and traumas, right? To keep us in this frequency prison of suffering and feed off of all the emotional luge related to the suffering and the projections and all of that, and keep us in a perpetual state of fear and suffering, and the matrix frequency of survival and just oppression and divide and conquer of fighting each other. So we want to also talk in general about trauma and then how this relates to the occult perspective, and how we can protect ourselves from these interferences and how this plays out in everyday life. Now, before we go deeper into the occult, let's just talk about trauma and what trauma actually is and the different kinds of trauma.
Yeah, so I can talk about that.
Yes, please. Thank you.
So trauma is really about this loss of connection to ourselves, to our family, to the people around us, and any moment in time where we lost this connection to our true self, likely a trauma occurred. And a lot of people understand trauma as like war, like abuse, like a serious accident. But a lot of us are suffering from what they call like little t trauma, which can be basically like anything, like it can be like starting a new job, it can be divorce, it can be conflict in the home, it can be any event where our needs weren't emotionally met as children because our parents weren't able to basically be like happy, attuned caregivers and reflect back to us our essence. So in the moment of trauma, it's similar to what happens when our soul fragments. It's not even similar. It's the exact same thing, where part of our soul like leaves the body in order to survive the traumatic event. Like the soul cannot take the pain of the experience, so it exits. And so in the process of healing trauma, what we're trying to do, similar to like a soul retrieval, we're trying to coax the spirit back into the body. Which brings me into an important element of healing trauma is having a safe community of like friends or family. And I'm not even talking about I'm not talking about biological family. I'm talking even about soul family, because these are the people who help us remember ourselves. So, and also another important thing to note is that trauma is a psychological process. Yes, it affects the way our mind thinks, but mostly I come from the school of thought that it's a biological process, meaning this trauma is trapped in our body as an unprocessed experience, and then it ends up showing itself later on in life through like chronic tension, through stomach issues, through on a worser end of the spectrum, even cancer can be a result of trauma. So when we're traumatized, we really need to regain this connection to ourselves, our true self. And what they talk about in a lot of trauma work is this idea of like being able to regulate our nervous system. That's an aspect of healing trauma. And what happens when we're traumatized is we're not able to regulate our nervous system. Either we get locked into fear or we disassociate. So we can't actually like ride the waves of life in a healthy way. Like something small will get us locked in fear or disassociated. So healing trauma is also about learning how to regulate your nervous system as well. And we do that when we are able to make safe attachments with people where we know that they're not going to act out their own wounds on us, and we're able to just be ourselves and also attune to them as well. So I think that kind of like sums it up, but essentially trauma also prevents us from being in the present moment and responding accurately to what's happened, because whatever is happening externally is triggering some old trauma in our body. And so our reaction to the event is going to be a lot greater than maybe what should be like a typical reaction to that thing. And one more thing I want to mention too is a good way, I've just read this randomly on Instagram, but a good way of telling if you're in a traumatic response for the most part is if your reaction is over a 5 to something. And this is also keeping aside the big T trauma, so if you're in a car accident, you have a crazy response, of course, that's normal. Your life has been threatened. But I'm talking about, someone writes something on Facebook that triggers us or something, and we're like, I got to tell them what my opinion is. Often it's actually our trauma and our sense of ourselves that's being activated, and that person is reminding us of that. So basically this undischarged energy that wants to resolve itself, like Peter Levine gives a good analogy of how animals in the wild, they don't get traumatized because they know how to shake it off. But humans more than often will disassociate, and that undischarged energy is what gives rise to symptoms of trauma. So we need to basically complete that cycle by, discharging the energy, getting rid of the anger, not on another person, but finding a way to discharge it through some sort of somatic therapy or body-mind practice. And then this helps release the aspect of trauma. So, and then just one more thing I want to note, a few, just to bring clarity to. So these 3 symptoms of trauma I find are really useful is hyperarousal, disassociation, and constriction. So the hyperarousal, it was when your nervous system is really activated. Disassociation is when you've checked out, and constriction is when we tense up. And I don't know one person who doesn't have like chronic tension in some part of their body, and people who say they don't actually typically are checked out of their body. So yeah. Pretty much everyone has been traumatized, to be honest.
No, that also ties into the question, because some people ask, is everybody truly traumatized? Some people actually claim that they're not traumatized, because I think most people, when even the word trauma, most people think of the big T traumas, right? Of just severe sexual abuse, rape repeatedly, or physical abuse, or war, veteran, experiences, concentration camps, all of that. So, these are definitely big T traumas, but the small T traumas, like you said, can be anything, even in a so-called happy childhood, because no parents were perfect, and they can traumatize us even in little ways, but it can, when we are infants and young children, not being, our emotional needs not being met, right? Or being punished for something, or having gotten the belt like I did, that can be extremely traumatic in the sense, even if it doesn't seem like this at first. Right. So that can, and I was understanding that the root word for trauma relates to wound. So it's also just basically being wounded. So we all have that to varying degrees. And you made a very important point. It's important to understand that the trauma is stored in the body. Like we talked about this before, karma in the body. And, I am actually give a weekly talk at this retreat center here in Malibu about the body-mind connection and all of that, and emotional intelligence, and also from a bodywork perspective, since this is part of my work, bodywork massage. And yeah, like you mentioned, chronic tension in the body means the body's always is actually holding on something, the muscle always contracting. And this chronic tension, most people make the assumption that it just relates to bad posture, being on the computer all the time, on the phone, or driving a car. Yes, and there's some truth to it if we always do the repetitive movements, right, and don't work out or just move our bodies in a more conscious ways. But most of it is actually literally, tension is literally related to suppressed emotions, wounds, and traumas that have never been shaken off, like you said, have never been able to resolve itself to be fully felt through and experienced. Right. Yeah. So we carry, even like when you think about it, most of us carry tension in our necks, back, lower back, hips, wherever. It's the back of the body. And the back of the body is also somewhat associated with the past. So we carry the past with us. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we all have this tension. And then also on top of it, we live in a world that is completely removed from nature and spirit, where pathology has become normalized. So simply by growing up in the society we live in, we become wounded and traumatized. And just because we are more and more being removed from essence, and that ties obviously into the matrix control system, how these forces want to keep us in this traumatized state, because that's where they tag into. That's how we're being controlled, because it gets us out of body. We become disembodied, right? And then something else can take over. And most often when we get triggered by whoever, especially in social media, like you said, it's most often actually a trauma wound is being triggered. We experience this a lot on Facebook when we challenge, obviously we have certain challenging views or information, not only related to official culture, history, but also to certain new age spiritual beliefs people are very identified with. Yeah. Hence, they get very, very easily triggered. I mean, this happened recently. I know you have your course coming up soon with Kelsey, which is really a great course. I can highly recommend it for any woman. The Rebirth of the Feminine, diving deep.
Birth of the New Feminine.
Rebirth of the New Feminine, excuse me. Which goes deep into facing the toxic feminine as well. Right? Yeah. So, and that, you want to talk about? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, and that just also, this course, without giving too much away, what we're going into is, obviously our own personal wounds and our family of origin, how we've been traumatized in this life, how this led to toxic relationships, but also looking at like this thousands of year trauma that we're faced by being genetically manipulated basically by aliens a really long time ago, and what that meant for us, and the kind of sacrifices that needed to take place as well in regards to that. So, this is why, basically no one's been not traumatized, because to me, we were traumatized a really long time ago.
That's that's a very important point, because what we talk a lot about the importance of somatic work, psychotherapy, and I know you're also taking Gabor Mate's course, and he's also doing incredible work, and Peter Levine. And the somatic psychotherapy is very important, but it most often stops in childhood, right? Yeah. And it's important to understand it and heal it, but that's also limited, because a lot of trauma relates to karma as well that we're dealing with is based on thousands of years ago, past lives, even the original genetic modification, cutting down our DNA, and also more fringe topics of the alien invasion and all of that, which may be a bit out there for some people. But if you really look at it from the more bigger perspective with a very open mind, you also see that, history, the official history, is not the truth by any stretch of the imagination, but it ties into many, many aspects. So right now, what's also coming up during this time of transition is a lot of ancestral, but also past life trauma. All the stuff we have accumulated over thousands and thousands of years needs to come up to be healed and transmuted. And the whole point of healing and transmuting and working through trauma and wounding is to anchor the divine force, to align with divine will, our true essence, bring the essence to the front. Mm-hmm. And that's really also that process of embodiment is also the process of awakening, or even ascension, so to speak.
Yeah, and Peter Levine makes a really good point that, trauma is basically hell on earth, but trauma resolved is a gift from the gods. And if we can actually work through and face our traumas, not just our personal, but our collective ones, then we basically get completely reborn in this lifetime. And not only that, if we can, like, the bigger topic is really facing this collective trauma that has happened to humanity, which a lot of people don't want to go there. They want to dismiss it, which is fine. It's mostly, honestly, the people who are subscribed to the New Age, which is its own agenda on its own. A lot of people who get into these New Age teachings are obviously deeply wounded, and then it just gives them a little bit of an opiate so they can feel better, so they're not so much interested in really deeply exploring the shadow. They might talk about shadow work, but I mean, real shadow work is like messy, uncomfortable, and will trigger your traumas, guaranteed. Like, that's why it's your shadow. So these are the kind of places we need to go to. But then when we actually go through our traumas and actually work through them, like, I feel like there's almost a feeling of like, invincibility, because that you can go through all of these hardships in life and actually turn it into a power and more understanding of like the duality of life that we're playing with, which includes like the light and the dark, and being able to hold those kind of polar views within your view of reality, and not just taking a New Age spiritual bypass by being like, oh, it's all love or whatever, when there's Jeffrey Epstein in the news all the time, and this child pedophilia, sex trafficking rings. And yet, and this is the view that some people like to take. And I think it's also because there's just fear there, because they actually haven't gone deeper. Because I would say, like, there's a huge, like, spiritual awakening happening, yes, but I find that like a lot of people actually aren't truly sincere in going into trauma. They might be interested in it as a topic, but really going into it, like, this is really difficult stuff.
Exactly.
And it's also stuff, by the way, that you can't do on your own as well. You need the support of a community. And so, yeah, it's for me, I actually find a lot of like peace and solace in it, because it gives me a context and narrative for stuff that happened to me. For instance, I never really understood what like implicit memory is before I started like getting into understanding trauma. And implicit memory is basically the way that our nervous system was wired in those first 3 years of birth. It was based off of our mom's nervous system. Like, our mom was the one regulating us. So if our mom wasn't relaxed and happy and able to navigate her own emotions in a mature way, like, our nervous system was going to be wired for fear. And this is like the kind of almost primal fear response, which comes up in a lot of people, and they don't even know where it's coming from, And then also leading into this topic that we're trying to get into, whenever we're locked in fear, that's when, and especially whenever we check out of our body, that's a perfect entry point for something else to take over us, which leads to an even deeper topic. It's like, what traps of agreement we may have made in a past life for a being to enter us as well. So it's like a huge spiral, and you can't really disconnect trauma from occult forces, because I really feel the original trauma that happened to humanity was because of this genetic manipulation. And that's what we're basically, like, if we really want to take spirituality beyond this like mainstream Buddhism, like love and light, whatever, wherever it's at now, crystals, yoga, whatnot, we really have to address this issue and look at it, objectively. A lot of people, because this is where it's led me, honestly, because I looked at my own stuff, but then it's like, no, there's a dark, ancient energy which exists on Earth, like, humanity is checked out. Humanity is collectively traumatized. And I feel like this has been going on for so long that our DNA is literally getting so disconnected from nature and spirit. We're going to be the perfect portals for like basically like AI to enter us, because we're not present anyway. Of course, we're going to just be like, we're already doing that by relying so much on technology and our phones.
Yeah, which is also the end game, the transhumanism AI agenda to get us more and more out of body and all of that. But what you just said reminds me of something that's very interesting, because, I'm also, by the way, the book by Peter Levine you were quoting from or mentioning, I think that's in an unspoken voice. Is it that one?
Yeah, there's that one, and there's Waking the Tiger, and then there's Healing Trauma.
Just
I think
for the
Healing
listeners.
Trauma actually was like his latest one. And he, yeah, sorry, just gonna say something really quick about him.
Yeah.
He's actually great because he's one of, I think maybe even the first person who brought in the somatic perspective, whereas according to psychology before then, they were like, trauma is incurable because the brain got locked in fear and they didn't know how to unlock it because they were just taking it from this mind cognitive approach, which obviously you know, it's similar to the whole new age thing. It's like, you know, if you think happy thoughts, everything will be fine. That's not the case, because all of your memories are stored in the body, and as long as you haven't handled that, it hasn't been handled. So
yeah, you can even fool yourself, what you mentioned, with people not being very sincere, because I've fallen in this trap myself. You can actually know your issues and your traumas intellectually, like, oh, I know I've been abused, and kind of like fool yourself that you have worked through it because you understand it, but your body hasn't processed yet.
yeah.
And it's important to dive deep to feel these emotions so locked in, not to identify with the emotions, not to project it, but transmute them by feeling them, which can be very messy sometimes, right?
Yeah, and you have to also have the ability to be embodied enough to recognize like what's going on with your nervous system, like what's your pulse, like how's the energy feeling in your body. Like I didn't think that I had that capacity until I had a consistent yoga and meditation practice, which I'm not saying everyone needs to do yoga, although by the way, Besser, van der Kolk, and Peter Levine also highly recommend yoga as a way of healing trauma because of how much it kind of fleshes out the emotions, and it also gains that mind-body connection. But a lot of people are so disconnected and disassociated, they don't even know when they're in that aroused state. You know?
That's the problem I see with most people. They're so, you know, disembodied, disconnected from their bodies, that, you know, there needs to be baby steps to actually go back into the body first, to feel even your body on the basic physical level before even diving into trauma, and then tapping into the body intelligence, because we have this amazing body intelligence that is always striving towards health and healing and supporting us if we give it the right space.
Yeah.
So the first key is, like you said, relaxing the nervous system, because most people are checked out in a way, disembodied, dissociated, or in fight and flight and stress response all the time, just by the way we live, right? It's become normal, and it's normal to be busy and go, and people cannot sit still anymore. So that's when these basic body mind practices come into place, or meditation, to just slow things down and get into the body first, just on the basic physical level.
Yeah, exactly. And like we, you know, in trauma therapy, they talk about like regulating your nervous system. And I think that that's a very rare trait of someone who knows how to do that. You know, obviously, once you start practicing yoga, hopefully you start picking up that skill and recognizing, okay, you know, even before this call, like I had a little bit of a anxiety attack out of nowhere. And I was like, I just need to lie down. I felt where it came from, which usually comes from my back, my shoulders and neck, and just calm that down before I get into this. You know, I have to recognize that. And it's also, you know, I don't try and like get my mind too involved with it, you know, even though, you know, the mind loves a narrative for why this is happening, you know, but I try and just get away with that and just focus on the basic sensation and give it presence and give it breath as well.
Yeah.
So,
you know, so what I wanted to mention before, because it reminded me of something like, you know, with the work of Peter Levine, who does an amazing work, also Gabor Mate, you know, he has done amazing videos out there on lectures on YouTube. And I know you're taking his course, Compassion Inquiry, which is very, very helpful and insightful. And all these amazing, you know, actually there's something great happening in the Western psychotherapeutic world, somatic world, to address trauma through the body, right? And somewhat even Gabor Mate, like, dabbles a bit in spirituality. I know he had talk with Adyashanti, you know, questioning him, or he's big into H.L. Almas. What's his name?
H. Almas,
yeah, the diamond approach. Very high, very great series. But, you know, I see this schism, or like not schism, division, but like, you know, these two different approaches. And like you said, everything is just so interrelated and connected. You know, we need to bring everything up, our past history, you know, all where we truly came from, and all of that, the collective trauma, even the genetic modification, and all of these ties also into the occult, hyperdimensional realities, and all of this entity possession, you know, and interferences. But it's mostly, I see two camps. Some people are like evenly just completely focused on psychotherapy, therapy, somatic work, like Peter Levine, Gabor Mate, great. But then it gets them also locked in their own tunnel vision. When you also realize, you know, a lot of the trauma people are dealing with is actually not the activation point might be in this lifetime, but the creation point is from a past life. And most often is also related to entity attachment, earthbound attachments, you know, which Dr. William Baldwin has talked about a lot, or even recently, we talked also about this. He was a psychotherapist in prison, Jerry Marcinski, researching schizophrenia, and it's very much completely related to entities, attachments, and giving thought injections, right? And it's not a chemical imbalance or anything like that. It can be cured with pharmaceuticals, right? And then on the other side of the coin, you have a lot of people I've noticed in the Matrix fringe movement who just get completely hooked on the entity hyperdimensional topic, most often falling into blame victim trap and get hooked just on this intellectual information, but kind of dismiss or ignore or don't know about basic psychotherapeutic work, embodiment work, shadow work, and all of that healing childhood trauma getting into the body. You know, so it, like, ideally it would be great if both could merge together like this. I feel we need this holistic approach on all of that. And then even the third step, so to speak, is then also bringing in the divine, right? The higher force, to connect, you know, alignment with the divine, the aspiration, the surrender, which has nothing to do with any religious dogmatic God out there, but our divine essence, right? So it's also because many people, I can see this myself, or maybe you as well, sometimes we can also get sometimes lost in the shadow work and digging, like Sri Aurobindo talked about it, you know. I mean, it was back in the 20s, it was very critical of Western psychology, mostly mentioning Freud, which Freud has that's a can of worms in itself. But Sri Aurobindo talked about always digging in the mud, and not bringing in the light at the same time. So it's what we talked about before, the ascend and descend at the same time, and bringing in all and everything, this whole more holistic view of humanity, reality, and some of the information of what the knowledge may be shocking to many people, right? But it needs to work all together to come to a true healing and, you know, essentially reconnecting to our true self.
Yeah, and you made a good point. You know, this past life trauma, death trauma that often shows up in phobias, basically. Like lots of people who have phobias of heights had a trauma where they died, you know, falling off something. And if spiders, another good example, you know, a lot of that is pretty well known in like occult literature, is that indication of some deeper past life trauma as well. But I think it's also, you know, that's, you know, you made a good point. Like people tend to go wanting to get in the past lives right away and like blaming it on something else. And like all of us, like our accumulation of every single lifetime is happening in this life. So we could basically handle it in this life. But I think for people who really want to go deeper and I know for myself, like just either through coming across people who did past life readings or even my own memories, like this is also what starts to come up deeper in the awakening process. You actually, I feel a lot of people, you'll start to, you know, either emotionally remember or you'll start getting fragments of stuff that happened beyond this lifetime. And you'll know because that energy will feel very ancient.
Yeah.
And you'll know that it's beyond this life. Like it's hard to describe what ancient feels like, but anyone who's listening knows what I'm talking about, where you're like, whoa, this is a deeper, darker energy than just something that happened with my mom and dad or something.
Exactly. I can relate to, I even wrote about an experience in my recent last essay, Universal Laws and Karma in the Body, but an experience I had, you were with me when we were, you know, at the Eco Village, and something really triggered me on Facebook. Some guys who I thought was my friend, and this sense of betrayal just came up, right? And it was just over exaggerated, and like it was so exaggerated, it was also felt there were interferences, you know, call forces tagging into that, because that's what they do. They put almost fuel onto the fire to, you know, to find that entry point to make it worse than it actually is, quote unquote. Right. And, you know, to feed off of that emotional reaction illusion, or like Sri Aurobindo said, to make a mountain out of a molehill. But at the same time, when I was processing it with Reggie Ray's technique of the somatic descent, you know, Reggie Ray is another amazing, he's a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, but also includes somatic work. I think he has studied Peter Levine's work, and he does some amazing deep somatic meditations, which I almost feel are not for beginners. They're a bit more advanced. But I did this whole
somatic descent is actually meant to be more of an advanced program because it builds off of all his other stuff. But his meditations, like, it's for people who are very wanting to seriously meditate, not just wanting to imagine like visualization or something.
So, you know, when I did his work, went through this process, you know, then all the stuff came up all of a sudden. And like you said, it felt all of a sudden very ancient. And I was weeping and crying. And I realized that had nothing to do with just a childhood issue or being bullied in school, as I used to be as well. There was something deep past life related that was processed in the moment.
Yeah.
But like you said as well, I didn't know the story. I didn't need to know the story of a past life, right? Because everything is already here in the moment. As long as we can access somatically, emotionally, we can process it all without having to know that story. On the
Yeah.
other end of the equation, you can actually also delude yourself with like figuring out your past lives, and the ego gets hooked on it and making up a story or distorting it from what actually happened, right? So, I mean, Sri Aurobindo talked about it in Karma and Rebirth in his book, that it's actually extremely hard, if not almost impossible, to truly remember past lives, right? It's more like the soul records certain experiences, which also have its place based on universal law like karma, cause and effect. So it's also about taking self-responsibility, because things are always coming back around to one degree or another. Right?
And it also gets tricky too, because, we do create false memories, and this is not, well, Gabor Mate makes a point that he's like, he doesn't really necessarily believe that there's like a false memory, rather that that's how our brain created a narrative out of the feeling of what happened. Does that make sense? So if you had an experience, where you were crying, or crying as a child, you might process that as like, you might actually have a false memory of that being related to abuse, when it could be just your mom didn't come in time to hold you, because that's how your brain processed it. So we can create these memories and narratives, because the mind like loves narratives to understand, but that may not be what actually happened as well. So that's kind of leads into that. But then, this also.
Can I just say something to that real quick?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's interesting with this. I can totally see this from the Gabor Mate's perspective. But then going more into the occult and the fringe and the alien agenda and abduction phenomena, but it's this whole, that's a whole rabbit hole in itself. And I've presented that in depth in the documentary UFOs, Aliens, and the Question of Contact, going deep into the abduction phenomenon, that there's such a thing as screen memories, right? Where these aliens implant a different memory that completely contradicts what actually happened. Mostly very pleasant, having enlightening experiences, seeing these aliens as friends. But, then, people who are hypnotists who are very aware of the alien agenda, like Dr. Carla Turner talked about this as well, piercing through the screen memory and then actually uncovering what truly happened, which is most often very disturbing. And I feel that's what, just on the side note, a lot of the new age people get caught into, like people who claim they have amazing, beautiful experiences, contactees with blue avians, aliens, grays, but who knows what truly happened on an unconscious level beyond the screen memory of what they think they experienced.
Yeah. And also they don't seem to understand how aliens manipulate us via our emotions. Like that's actually what do you call it, a weakness to them, how emotionally influenced we are.
Exactly.
So they will present us things that they know will make us feel good. I even had an experience where I actually felt I was like on ecstasy, I've also had positive experiences of like bliss from hours of meditation. So, it's really slippery to get into as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, so let's talk about a little bit about this, how this, you mentioned Reggie Ray, trauma, creating this fake personality. I think that's a really important aspect to get into.
Yeah, I like there was this quote, something he said, because remember we talked about the beginning that everybody's traumatized to varying degrees, right? Yeah. And here's said something very interesting, because he literally says that the human ego is a trauma response itself, right? And do you have the quote there?
I have the quote, yeah.
Please, thank you.
Okay, so I posted this on Facebook, by the way, if anyone wants the actual quote. What we call catastrophic trauma is really an extreme case of a pattern and a dynamic that all of us as human beings share. And the human ego itself is a trauma response, in a sense that it represents a separation from experience, an attempt to construct a disassociated state in which we live with a relative amount of security and harmony. That's what we're trying to do with the human ego. So when we're working with the human ego, we are really working with trauma, which is, that makes complete sense, because it's like, because if we don't have our essence mirrored back to us by like happy, attuned, present caregivers, which I think Gabramate said something similar to that. He's like, who's had parents like that and no one had? Like, it's actually really sad. But it's actually a fundamental need we have as children to have our essence mirrored back to us so that essence can develop. But instead, we often get shamed and punished. So we end up creating this false personality in order to get along in the world, in order to get our needs met. And then this is what needs to be abandoned later on, is we've created our whole world around this identity, which is based off of not having to feel the pain of the original trauma that we experienced.
Yeah. So how this, maybe we can dive a little bit into how this ties into the Matrix and the Matrix installment program, how this is being used for us to keep us in this frequency prison, right?
Yeah.
To keep us wounded, traumatized, and keep basically re-traumatizing us. That's really what's happening, since pathology literally has become normalized on so many levels in this world we're living in. Right. So, and it taps into what you just said. This trauma creates this fake personality that people identify with. Right. And then it goes on to deeper levels. I know you and Kelsey talked about in the last podcast about MK Ultra, right? That's literally MK Ultra program is a Matrix trauma installment program. We all, people who, I'm sure most people by now have heard of MK Ultra. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a fact, right? And that's still happening on, very deep shadow government levels, and relates to you can even see it from an occult perspective, what's happening in installing trauma, especially in young children, especially through the use of sexual energy, sexual trauma, sexual abuse, rape, is to create this disassociated state in order to install an entity, a force, a demonic entity, which ties into what you talked about before, the trap of agreement.
Yeah.
That's the universal law of it. You make an agreement, with another entity, and many times we may have done in our past lives these kind of trap of agreements to get more power, which then hooks you up in the contract with an even demonic draconian entity and anything in between.
Yeah.
Which, so it's also about taking the self-responsibility. I learned a lot about this from, maybe some people heard about it, holographic kinetics. It's an ancient Aboriginal healing modality which I recently studied. You can check that out on my website or just Google it as well. But this trauma just, again, is like the entry point through which these forces tag into us. And I've also noticed that they, I don't like to use the word attack, but target. It's not in the sense of get paranoia or victim blame, but these forces are very much aware. They know us even better than we know ourselves, and they exist out of the realm of time and space, so they can see our soul trajectory. So they're specifically drawn to people they're highly sensitive, psychic, or have a certain soul mission, certain talents to help through the shift right now, to, especially healers or renegades, or anybody who speaks out, to kind of like vector them off the path.
Yeah.
Right. And I feel something, even in your childhood, early adolescent, that has almost happened to you in a sense, right? How you got veered off the path with, especially you were definitely like, even from unseen levels, somehow targeted by these high level music industry musicians and whatnot, and almost try to like hook you into something you're not.
Yeah, I can talk about a bit about that. That kind of also leads into this like deeper kind of soul pattern at play, and how it shows up in a single lifetime and how it reflects the larger karmic lesson. So I definitely talked about this in another podcast, but I was basically I don't know the word for it. I guess it's more like sexual coercion, where I was like peer pressured to engage with someone sexually in order to receive gifts or benefits for my friends, So I was they made me get really drunk, and I'm not victimizing myself. It's just a setup. I was very young and naive back then. And I had to have sex with him. And interestingly, he had a huge painting of a demon over his bed. And then when I went to go see the psychic, Nicole, she basically told me that was what was the word she used? She said that was basically a reenactment of something happened in previous lifetimes. So she basically told the story of how, when women wanted to become priestesses, they were basically often sacrificed through a sex magic ritual to these gods, these demigods rather, in order to receive powers. And in doing so, they would also be able to be channelers for those so for those demigods, basically. So it's like you were giving your power away in order to receive the power of that god. And this is a trigger topic for many women because we've got into this whole like priestess kind of thing where women are kind of getting off on the same power that happened thousands of years ago without even questioning it. And for myself, this is a larger pattern at play, and it's kind of unfolded where that was basically the original entry point, not entry point, that was the original trap of agreement. But then through the trauma that happened in this lifetime, that whenever that got activated, I would get disembodied and then something else would take over. And it was an extremely dark, pathological, psychopathic energy. Like that's how bad it was. Because it was also, that was the entry point, like not looking at that trauma and like looking at the effects on my life. And obviously that trauma goes way beyond that single incident, but that was a turning point, and at that point, right after that happened, I got taken to a psychiatric hospital where they were actually
what is the name again? Because that's pretty well known.
Allen Memorial Institute, where they're actually doing those MK Ultra experiments, and they just gave me an insane prescription. That was, even my friends who like abuse prescription drugs for fun were like, I can't believe they're giving you this much clonazepam, which is what they were giving me, like a huge bottle. And not even like no empathy or no concern for my story, because I was basically telling them, I was like, I'm terrified all the time. I'm so scared of men, and I had this extreme fear of like being objectified and raped, basically because of what happened, and just wrote me out a really long prescription. And then just showing how it affected in my own life and how my trauma got activated. So obviously, if this is a very famous musician, whenever I heard like a song or I saw a t-shirt or something, it would almost like trigger this like mind control program in me where I would automatically disassociate and become that traumatized self, so that's how it affects people. And I think it affects people in lots of covert ways as well. And I think we all have these like trauma entry points and then these little things that trigger us. And then what happens is there's this splitting, and we have this split egoic personality as a trauma response, as Reggie Ray says, where we basically become this alternate personality that we've start identifying as ourself. And I know for myself, I started identifying with that personality and was like, oh, I'm like hypersexualized, I'm evil, and like all these things. I actually started identifying with it. And it took a long road for me to unpack that. But mostly I actually had to release it from my body somatically. And that was like the longest journey, there was even sexually, like there was sexual trauma trapped in me for a really long time that I had to work with. And I think, until we work with that kind of stuff, and work through our bodies, it's really hard to trust ourselves as well. And I think that's one element that starts getting back is like because your intuition, you don't know the difference between a safe situation or a not safe situation. Like that ability to have that gut feeling and intuition about things is shut off. So, yeah.
So like, I'm also, when you're sharing the story and like looking at it from also more hyperdimensional occult perspective, you almost see also this unseen force weaving. There's a higher agenda behind it or something else that has been targeting as you as well. And through the trauma, you even shared me at some point, where we checked out in this false personality, is almost something else is being installed in you or working through you. Right, for certain amounts. And that's what we notice, like when we sometimes get easily, it can happen in everyday life, literally. When you check out of body, something has, if you get triggered on a scale over 5, in that moment, you may think, oh, your shadow's coming up, but this moment also another entity, occult force, adverse force is taking you over, using you to tag into that trauma. And that's the point key, to tag in the trauma and keep you in the trauma and then exaggerating it and keeping you re-traumatizing over and over, because for the simple reason that's the food they feed off of, the loosh of that kind of reaction, or this lower, special lower sexual energy pathologies and all of that, which we then enact in order to almost make ourselves feel better.
And then from a really basic perspective, we get trapped in time when you see women who get into abusive relationship after abusive relationship and they don't know how to get out of it. It's like they're just always attracted to these emotionally unavailable abusive people, narcissists and whatnot. It's because that trauma is literally looping, and what they're doing is they're looking for a resolution for it. Like I feel like there's at least an aspect of the human being, which is always striving for health and wholeness, but they're looking for it externally. So they're hoping the next narcissist or abusive person they get involved with will somehow, suddenly heal and change right in front of their eyes. And that will like make them feel some sort of redemption, but that actually cannot. Yes, it can happen in the context of safe relationships, but we need to not externalize that trauma and actually look within. And this is not to say we need to do the journey alone, because I really want to bring up an important point is like, for myself, I've realized, one of the gifts that we can offer if anyone listening is a counselor or a healer and they have people who are working with them with trauma, is being able to be that safe, attuned person to listen to someone, because that's the thing that most people were missing, is they didn't actually have someone who was like present, paying attention to them, mirroring back to them. That's the one thing they were missing. So just being able to offer that to people, as simple as it sounds, helps them regulate their nervous system. And like, you know what, I'm always going to have this person, not always, but, for however long you work with someone, I'm going to have this person who's going to listen to me, receive me. If they're really attuned, also reflect back my essence. And that's an important aspect of healing this trauma as well. And that also helps us, we need to get out of this like victim, blame, savior trap as well. At the same time, like taking self-responsibility doesn't mean doing everything on your own. As I think I took that alternate view. I was like, I'm just going to heal myself. I'm not even going to join a yoga studio.
And by the way, it also doesn't mean to blame yourself, right?
Yeah, exactly. But like, it's about being honest with where we're at and like seeing what kind of resources we need, what kind of support system we need, because that support system around us, like not only are we, we're creating the safe environment so that a healing can happen, but it's also an important aspect of us collectively healing trauma is that we start creating these places where there isn't, where pathology isn't normalized,
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me, I want to read a quote about of a quote by Dr. William Baldwin, whom I've quoted many times before. He is actually a founder of the therapy called spirit releasement therapy, of dealing how to, most with earthbound spirits, diseased people who have crossed over but haven't made the transition and then latch on other human beings and then work through them. But he also got deep into entity attachments, interferences, and he wrote a book called Close Encounters of the Possession Kind, a different kind of view of interference by otherworldly beings. So he talks also what we mentioned at the beginning, soul fragmentation, which is actually very the ancient definition of trauma, right, so to speak, from a more shamanic view. So he says, recovery of soul fragmentation is a clinical approach to soul retrieval, a traditional shamanic method of healing. In indigenous cultures, sickness was thought to be caused by a loss of one's soul or part of it, like loss of our essence, or the soul is not fully anchored in the body, not lack of embodiment. In clinical practice, we find that the condition of dissociation or fragmentation of consciousness is very common with people. Depending on the severity of the trauma, which leads to dissociation, the result can range just from mood changes to the often debilitating condition of multiple personality disorder.
Yeah.
Right. So multiple personality is also like, you create these alters, but this can also relates to installment of entities, because he goes on. Fragmentation presents a wide open door for any passing entity. If there are literally pieces missing from the soul essence of an individual, an entity can easily enter and attach. In a session, we often discover that this is the vulnerability which first allowed the attachment. Also relates to any unconscious wounds or blind spots, resulting in disembodiment and the body-mind split and so forth. He goes on, William James wrote and lectured on multiple personality and spiritual possession. And he suggested that, quote, if there are devils, if there are supernormal powers, it is through the cracked and fragmented self that they enter.
Mm-hmm.
And then he concludes, almost everyone is dealing with some degree of fragmentation. Who among us has not suffered at least some minor trauma in life? Fragmentation as a source of illness is an important concept of native healing traditions. It may prove to be an important thread in the rich tapestry of all holistic healing. So, so here we go. So he gives also ties into how trauma, soul fragmentation ties into entity attachments, or called force interferences, which everyone is dealing to varying degrees. Most people don't even know how they interfered with, because they, believe their own thoughts, never question their emotions, their desires, because these forces, it's the interference or the influence is oftentimes not that obvious. It can be since childhood, but it's influencing our desires, sexual desires for relationships, or, as I said, can be thought injections, thoughts we never question. We take everything as our own, but maybe related to an entity that's attached to ourselves, corresponding to a certain wound and trauma.
Yeah.
Now, the key is always, people always talk about, especially in my work, I mentioned it before, so many messages about, can I remove entities, clear them from entities, do a remote entity clearing work and all of that. And there are many people who claim to do this, right? And some are better than others, and there's definitely a lot of charlatans out there, but removing just an entity is just not enough. That's just, it's like symptom management, because you're not dealing with the cause, the root, which is the entry point.
It's like if you were to go to somebody who does Reiki and then go back to your abusive husband, then obviously the Reiki's going to wear off.
That's a good analogy. Yeah. And I've learned a lot of that also, from the modality holographic kinetics, which also deals with these contracts, these traps of agreements. Most often we have made agreements with entities in past lives, which are still active.
Yeah.
But we need, even from the Aboriginal ancient point of view, it's about taking self-responsibility, that at some point we created it based on a universal law of cause and effect, right? And trap of agreements do not necessarily happen consciously, but unconsciously. A lot of people get themselves into agreements of all kinds of occult hostile forces in the New Age by engaging in all kinds of superficial, distorted, pagan, Wiccan, priestess rituals, ceremonies, calling in entities, beings, ascended masters.
Yeah.
Which then, have understanding that these entities can appear adjust to the belief system of a person, right? And Shri Aurobindo talked about the faults, that these forces can appear as divine forces. You have to be very, very discerning, not only on the mind level, but on a psychic level, and understand occult laws and how these forces operate. Right.
Yeah, and those agreements we make can also come back around beyond this lifetime. So maybe in this lifetime, through doing some New Age manifestation ritual with some archangel or something, you could get a huge benefit from it. You get everything you want. You'd be like, this is amazing. And the cost may not even show it up until multiple lifetimes later, and it will come back around. So that's the tricky thing, is getting involved in these traps of agreements can actually veer you off for many lifetimes and get you more diluted, essentially.
Yeah. Now that's a good point, because eventually everybody's going to awaken in their own time at some point, but you can take some major detours, right?
Yeah.
Get yourself into a trap of agreements that require a few hundred more lifetimes to work out, or who knows what. It's also processes beyond the mind to comprehend and understand. But many things that even happen in our lifetimes, it's also still we're working out karma from past lives. So a lot of it is already set in stone, right? It's like, again, we talked about this on the forum, almost the paradox between free will and predestination, right?
Yeah.
And all that.
And also, that kind of also leads me into my own soul pattern, is the psychic who told me, even though she didn't tell me, I always had a feeling there was some deeper trauma that took place. And I even in my meditations, I started sensing basically demonic beings in my field. So this is before I even had any context for them. I was doing my love and light meditations or whatever I was doing. And I was like, whoa, there was an energy, very dark energy near me. But through these patterns and these ancient traps of agreements that many of us have made, a lot of us then started dabbling into the occult. And then a lot of our creations are coming back around. And the way that it showed up in my life is random, quote unquote, bad luck, which I still have PTSD around, because I would have really bad luck. All of a sudden, what would happen? Just bad luck, just sudden accidents, sudden bad luck in my life, and this was looking at it from this occult perspective. That was also because I, made this trap of agreement. I kind of got off on the magic and power of getting into those situations in this priestesshood. Then I started dabbling in magic. And even when in this lifetime, I started getting into that when I got into my New Age stuff, but very quickly, I was able to cause even physical changes in my atmosphere. Things would enter. And it would actually scare me, because I felt a part of my soul was wise enough to know what I was getting into. Whereas I feel like a lot of people just mess around with it because they get off on the power. They're like, wow, like I can metaphysically affect this physical reality. I can bring stuff in, not really realizing that there's always going to be a price to be paid that may not be apparent at first. Not only that, but their creation is often going to come back around.
Yeah, that's the power, power, the temptation for power always there in various forms. The matrix temptations, which also can, the big three areas: sex, money, and fame or power, right? So all of that, we see this, can create entry points and traps of agreements, right? And especially like, I see this as, what you mentioned also, I think you guys are going to touch it on in your course as well with women, because the women have been so suppressed and wounded and traumatized. So there's a lot of, unconscious rage and anger and the need to be more powerful. And then, can then easily, if they don't have more embodied practice, trauma practice to really heal the wounds, right? Latch on these identifications and power trips to make themselves feel better, right? Then they are very identified with this priestess stuff or who knows what. And then when you question it, as you experience on Facebook, you get quite the projections and triggered responses.
And a lot of
but it is coming from, there's the compassion, point comes into as well, because it does come from a wounded place.
Yeah. And and a lot of what we call women's empowerment / feminism is actually a trauma response. And it's and it's wanting to seek revenge for these wounds that we've experienced. I'm not saying that we shouldn't take action and speak out against people who are predators and abusing people, because it's also through our silence that we've been complicit. But it's when we are projecting that rage into it. And it's not that it's not going to maybe even give us the result that we want. It's that creation has also come back around. So to look at the energy behind what we're doing as well.
Yeah. So we're getting near the end of the first hour. So what are, we definitely want to talk more about in the second hour. I'd like to get more into also what we touched upon, MK Ultra and sexual ritualistic abuse, which ties into SAR, the Matrix Trauma Installment Program. Talk a little bit about today's outrage porn and social justice warriors, which also feeds the trauma in these forces, because it most often comes from a place of trauma and it works in favor of these forces. It ties into the Matrix agenda of divide and conquer.
Yeah, a good example of that is when they're like, remember the phrase trigger warning, which people put it, that's like, don't go here or else you're gonna get trauma activated.
Exactly, yeah. Look at more, I also want to talk into what we also touched upon. Let's go deep into some of the topics we already discussed it a little bit, targeted individuals who have a certain mission profile, which ties in the topic of wanderers or psychic sensitive people, and why children are also particularly targeted. Mental institutions, schizophrenia, and how this relates to entity possession, actually. And some of our own personal experiences. And also now looking at the truth movement, which I think we've touched upon before, but it also ties into this topic of trauma, occult forces in the matrix, because a lot of people fight the matrix or from a wounded trauma response, right? Projecting and kind of actually ironically giving the matrix more power by under the impression of fighting it or transcending it. So we'll go more all into that in the second hour. Again, the second hour is available for all the members, and also it gives you access to the membership forum where we have great discussions on there about all these topics. You can sign up if you're not already at veilofreality.com. And and again, if you're interested in our retreat Time of Transition, check that out as well. And Laura's course is also, when is it starting?
August 20th.
August 20th, yeah.
And we have limited spaces as well, and it is filling up quite quickly. So if anyone is interested in that, you can just go to my website at lauramatsu.com.
Okay, excellent. So see you guys in the second hour.